Today, our chair for this session is Mr. Justice Bernard Barton. He is a barrister and was a judge of the High Court until he retired a few months ago. He became a senior counsel in 1997, practiced on tort and contract and personal injury litigation, and has lectured in the King's Inn. He is also a grandnephew of the treaty delegate Bob Barton. So I'm going to hand over to Bernard to take us away.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon to everybody. We've had a great day already. It's most interesting, and we're going to look at the treaty negotiations in an entirely different light now. The paper that's about to be delivered, I think, is one which I hope people listening in will find fascinating. Our speaker today was born in 1963. Professor Chris Williams is a Welsh academic who has been head of the College of Arts, Celtic Studies and Social Sciences at University College Cork since 2017. He is an historian of considerable note and particularly a historian of modern Wales and of political cartooning and caricature in Britain, basically from the end of the French Revolution until the end of World War II. He's written a book on this. And indeed, he's a prolific author. He edited the diaries of the famous Richard Burton, which were published by Yale University Press. And amongst his many books, and I found that difficult to make a choice for the purpose of this presentation, are the monographies B.L. Combs and Capitalism, Community and Conflict, the South Wales Coal Field, 1897 to 1947, and the edited collection of Debating National and Nationhood and Governance in Britain, 1895 to 1945. The perspective from the four nations. Now, prior to taking up his role at UCC, Chris Williams was Professor of Welsh History at Swansea University and Professor of History and head of the School of History, Archaeology and Religion at Cardiff University, where he taught. He's also a former Royal Commissioner with the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales. His extracurricular activities include mountaineering, a subject on which he has lectured worldwide and indeed in Wales. And coming from that part of the world, I can tell you that he enjoys the sun and he likes a pint. Now, whatever about the former, certainly when he chose, in terms of the latter, when he chose to accept the post in UCC, he came to the right place. So up until now, and indeed for the rest, I suppose, of our session, our sessions in this conference, we'll be looking at very serious questions, as indeed the negotiations were. They were conducted seriously about serious issues, and they had serious consequences for the peoples on these islands. But what most of us would perhaps not be aware of is that they were also the focus of caricature and cartooning. And that's the paper which Professor to address us on today. So Professor Williams, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bernard. I'm a bit dismayed that you revealed my year of birth. That's been a closely guarded secret for a while now. But anyway, there we go. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see. Okay, I hope that's working. And I'm just going to start my slideshow. Yeah. So if that's all okay, if everybody can see that, I'll proceed. So thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And it's a great pleasure to have a small part to play in this conference. And I I venture onto the subject of Irish history with a little trepidation, not being a historian of Ireland myself. My focus today is on how the Anglo-Irish Treaty was depicted in political cartoons appearing in British newspapers and magazines. Bernard has already revealed my national identity, but this is signalled very clearly by the Welsh dragon on the title slide. And of course, the very title of Anglo-Irish Treaty makes those of us who are not English rather irritated. Not only is it inaccurate, but of course, in this particular context, it overlooks the critical role played in the negotiations, both by David Lloyd George and by the Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet, Thomas Jones. Now, analysis of political cartoons certainly doesn't replace the analysis of British public opinion that was carried out by George Boyne. Let me see, there we go, by George Boyce in his book Englishmen and Irish Troubles, British Public Opinion and the Making of Irish Policy, 1918 to 1922, a book which appeared in 1972. But I think that the analysis of political cartoons does have the capacity to supplement Boyce's study. Now, Boyce does use the cartoon image on the cover of his book, and he reproduces the cartoon inside the volume. It is Leonard Ravenhill's No Rest for the Wizard from Punch, 15th of October 1919. And it shows Lloyd George unable to take 40 winks as he is buzzed by the Irish question mosquito. Boyce also reproduces Bernard Partridge's A Cabinet Picture from Punch in November 1921. But in both cases, Boyce only gave the year of publication, not the issue, and he made no reference to the cartoonists by name. He does refer to a third cartoon, Yap, by David Lowe, which I shall show later, if only to dismiss it as an example of the newspaper's lack of understanding of the issues at stake. So whatever the fine qualities of George Boyce's book, and I've read it with great interest myself, I think he really barely scratched the surface of the political cartoon material available on the topic. And to my knowledge, and I'm ready to be corrected on this, I've not come across anything really done on this topic since then. Now, I could go into an argument for the importance of the political cartoon to an understanding of public opinion at this point, but I'll sort of take that as read, if I may, in the interests of time, only to say that I think the political cartoon should not be omitted from consideration. Political cartoonists were increasingly, in the interwar period, important journalists in their own right. They became celebrities in some respects. And I think you have to take questions of cartoon authorship seriously. They were individual artists. They had their own styles, beliefs, their approaches. If I just go back to the title slide, I've actually identified a number of the ones I'll be touching on today there with their self-portraits or photographs. So for me, it doesn't suffice simply to refer to a cartoon appearing in Punch or another publication, unless you go on to provide much more contextual information and analysis. For the purpose of today's paper, I've looked at political cartoons appearing across 9 British publications from the left to the right of the political spectrum, and including daily newspapers, Sunday papers, weekly papers, and satirical magazines. So we have on the far left, The Communist, we have the Daily Herald, which was more or less aligned with the Labour Party. In the centre, we have The Star and Reynolds News. A bit right of the centre, the News of the World and Punch. And then clearly on the right wing, the Cardiff Conservative Daily, the West Mail, and Horatio Bottomley's weekly John Bull. And across these publications, the work of no fewer than 7 prominent contemporary cartoonists feature. All of them were working, of course, in Britain, but they come from a number of different places, which I think is very interesting. We have the Australian Will Dyson, the New Zealanders David Lowe and William Hope, the Ulster-born cartoonist Matthew Sandford, or Matt, Bernard Partridge and Frank Holland were Londoners, and J.M. Staniforth was something of an Anglo-Welshman born in Gloucester, but had lived most of his life in Cardiff. I've identified over 80 political cartoons on the Irish situation that appeared between June and December 1921. So this is the sort of the chronology that I've been operating within. I think there's certainly the potential for a broader study of British political cartoons on Ireland throughout the War of Independence and going on then into the period of the Civil War as well. It's by no means an exhaustive survey. There were other newspapers carrying cartoons at this point. These are becoming more and more accessible through the British Library's project to digitize the newspaper press. So of the cartoons, of the publications covered here, just go back to this slide, I've carried out comprehensive studies of most of these papers. The exceptions would be David Lowe's work for The Star, which I've accessed through the British Cartoon Archive housed by the University of Kent in Canterbury, and Matt's sketches of prominent personalities, which appeared originally in the Daily Sketch. These were published as a standalone volume in 1922. Now, the quality of some of the reproductions is not always high because one is using digitized sources in many instances. The situation in Ireland was certainly a regular subject for political cartoonists throughout 1919, 1920, and the first half of 1921. So I've gone from the point in June 1921 when it appeared first that an end to hostilities was likely, and second, that negotiations might begin. And I've gone on to the end of the year, and specifically to the ratification of the treaty in the Houses of Parliament in mid-December. After this point, British press interest subsides somewhat and is replaced by other topics. And I think that's understandable in the context that most newspapers rarely carried more than one political cartoon per issue. And so they were focusing on whatever was the most important issue of the moment. Even Punch usually only carried 2 political cartoons in each week's issue. So if a topic wasn't at the forefront of contemporary debate, it was unlikely to feature as subject matter. Well, having set out those chronological boundaries, I'm immediately going to subvert them, if only to take advantage of an early opportunity to introduce the work of David Lowe. So David Lowe's SOS from Lowe appears in The Star on the 7th of January 1921. Lowe was a stylistic revolutionary. He frequently put himself in the frame in a way that no other political cartoonist had dared to. Here he is at the top. And Lowe was a critic of hardline British policy in Ireland. He'd actually compared what was going on in Ireland with the Amritsar massacre in an earlier cartoon. And in this example, he reflects on the appreciation, in inverted commas, his Irish cartoons had brought him, which he suggests with tongue-in-cheek had led him to moving his studio into a dugout and to him creating a new type of black and tan pictured in the bottom left of the frame. And the top third of the cartoon shows Lowe reflecting on various threatening messages he'd received. And as you can see, the cartoon as a whole is pocked by bullet holes. So you've got this sense, certainly from some cartoonists, that Ireland is a controversial topic and that some of the opinions that they are expressing through their work are not necessarily finding favour with the reading public. Cartoons produced to mark the visits of the King to Belfast to open the new Parliament on the 22nd of June reinforce the sense I have of the range available in political cartoons appearing in British publications of contrasting and varied political perspectives, reminding us, if we needed to be reminded, that British public and political opinion on the war in Ireland was far from unified. So Bernard Partridge's Ireland's King from Punch, 29th of June, is a rather bullish cartoon. It somewhat implausibly suggests that nationalist Dublin is jealous of King George's visit to Unionist Belfast, but that Dublin might still benefit from a visit from Ireland's King if ye'll be after putting your house in order and asking him. Well, this is a very traditional cartoon in tone and format, and it's reminiscent of those that attended Queen Victoria's visits to Ireland. Wholly different is a double-page cartoon by Will Hope, who used the pen name Espoir, that appeared in The Communist on the 2nd of July 1921, which showed a rather apprehensive monarch glimpsed through a forest of soldiers' bayonets, and which was accompanied by an extract, actually a pastiche of 2 extracts from issues of the Daily Herald reporting on the visit and conveying a very different impression than Partridge had of, as the caption puts it, loyal Ulster, really stressing the stringent security measures that surrounded the royal visit for fear of some kind of assassination attempt. So you have these 2 cartoons, Punch, very traditional by this stage, weekly satirical magazine, been around for 80 years. And on the other hand, you have this relatively new publication, The Communist, which of course is taking a very left-wing position. Now, within days, of course, of the King's visit, was known that David Lloyd George had invited both Eamon de Valera and James Craig to open discussions about bringing the war to an end and identifying a permanent solution. For the Australian cartoonist Will Dyson, Lloyd George's reputation for what might generously be termed wizardry presented challenges for Sinn Féin, captured in Sinn Féin's Excusable Caution that appeared in the Daily Herald on the 28th of June, where de Valera asks an unidentified colleague for a pair of tongs before he picks up an invitation presumably issued by the wily Welshman. But that said, I think wherever British commentators were on the political spectrum, there appears to have been a warm welcome given to the truce that came into effect on the 11th of July, and a certain amount of optimism anticipating the initial meetings between Lloyd George and de Valera that took place from the 14th to the 21st of July. So J.M. Staniforth, in preparing for the great event, the Western Mail, 13th of July, shows the Angel of Peace welcoming a clearly cheerful Lloyd George, de Valera, and I think it's James Craig there depicted on the right, to a peace conference, whilst the traditional figure of Erin disposes of murder, arson, outrage, and kidnapping in the Irish truce dustbin. And of course, this female figure of Erin was regularly deployed by cartoonists at this time, and indeed in previous eras, as a sort of stereotype, as standing for the nation of Ireland and perhaps for some kind of soul or Irish public opinion, as interpreted, of course, by British cartoonists who were usually not sympathetic to Republican aspirations. Bernard Partridge provides us with another example, a rather ponderous classical set piece showing Erin or Ireland, complete with harp, welcoming the promise of rain, that is peace, on a parched land in Punch on the 13th of July. Other cartoonists were more radical in their artistic approach. There was a great deal of interest in learning more about the leaders of Sinn Féin, and this provided an opportunity for caricature in addition to political cartoons. David Lowe offered portraits of de Valera, complete with, as Lowe put it, his Downing Street smile, and Arthur Griffith in The Star, 14th of July, while Matthew Sanford, also drew de Valera and provided a brief commentary on the strange, gaunt figure with his tortoiseshell pince-nez and rugged features, an extremist and a visionary, yet not an irreconcilable nor a fanatic. The context in which Ireland's future constitutional status and territorial limits were now being debated prompted some to historical, even spiritual, reflections. For Espoir, who depicted a fictional gathering of Winston Churchill, Craig, Lloyd George and de Valera in the Communist on the 23rd of July, the deliberations were missing the influence and the insight of James Connolly, whose image or shade is seen on the wall behind. Lloyd George wondering whether everyone is in the room. Bernard Partridge was more didactic. This time, the shade of Charles Stewart Parnell is telling de Valera that he should be satisfied with the half of the offer of dominion status and home rule that de Valera himself, here shown in late August, was finding difficult to accept. Now, this cartoon may well have picked up on the official British communication to de Valera at this time, which made use of other historical parallels involving both Daniel O'Connell and Thomas Davis. And Jan Smuts's advice to Sinn Féin on the desirability of remaining within the British Empire also featured in some cartoons. Now, as we know, the viability and the direction of the negotiations were not straightforward even before the conference proper began in October. Bernard Partridge rediscovered a lightness of touch in his observations on the somewhat impromptu gathering of the cabinet convened in mid-September in Inverness, while Lloyd George was on holiday in the Scottish Highlands. In the problem play, Punch, 14th of September, he shows our ever jeune premier conning his part. Now here am I, a Welshman, look you, and I have to come on in a Highland set and play a scene in English, all about Ireland with a Spanish American and lead up to a happy ending. Well, well, I hope it will be all right on the night. The correspondence between de Valera and Lloyd George was, of course, being published regularly in the press by this stage, and to some, the intricate differentials between the aspirations of the contending parties led to frustration. David Lowe's Yap, which appeared in the Star on the 21st of September, represented it as a squabble between two, I think possibly grandmothers or wet nurses, over the naming of the Irish freedom baby. De Valera prefers sovereign, Lloyd George responds with dominion. George Boyce, in his 1972 study, referred to this cartoon's reproduction in the Daily News the following day, stating that the newspapers hardly realised that both men were still jockeying for position before committing themselves to a conference. To the newspapers, it was merely, and he quotes the Daily News, a weary farce which has imperiled the peace of two countries for a very nearly meaningless phrase. When the conference proper opened in London, the appearance of the Irish delegation again occasioned considerable interest and provided further opportunities for the caricaturists. Lowe drew mysterious Mick Collins and de Valera's English friend, Erskine Childers, while Matt chose to focus on James Craig, who was, of course, not in the conference, but whose presence, whether it was real or imagined, loomed on the edge of the discussions. I'm not sure whether Matt understood exactly what he was writing in his parallel commentary to this cartoon when he said of Craig that he had something of the Cromwell look. But he also noted more playfully that Craig was a great yachtsman, though owing to colour blindness, navigation lights puzzled him at first. Despite this, or because of it, he has not been put off his political course by any Sinn Féin danger signal. J.M. Staniforth, in The Voyage Has Commenced, News of the World, 16th of October, emphasised the collective nature of the conference, the delegates together here seeking the route through treacherous seas to a satisfactory settlement of the Irish question and peace. At the tiller is Lloyd George, but accompanying him in the conference boat are Austin Chamberlain, Winston Churchill, Michael Collins, and two rather more indistinct Sinn Féin characters. Once the conference had begun its proceedings, most British commentators, wherever they stood on the political spectrum, hoped for and anticipated that there would somehow be a settlement. Horatio Bottomley, in the populist right-wing magazine John Bull, devoted a double-page editorial to the aspiration for peace with honour on the 26th of November, with Frank Holland's cartoon that you can see here situated amidst the prose commentary. And I think that the second paragraph, particularly of the text that surrounded this, is worth quoting, because I think it shows how far right-wing opinion in Britain had travelled by the end of November. Bottomley writing, "It will be, to my mind, a profound calamity for the province itself and the empire at large if Ulster cannot see her way to accept an adequately protected status under some form or other of Dominion government. I am hopeful that the conference may yet find a way out of the jungle of racial and religious strife, and that the dream of a united Ireland may soon be realised." So now at this stage, of course, the public focus had largely shifted away from the question of Dominion status towards the issue of Ulster, and Frank Holland's cartoon crudely represented the critical issues as being the opposition of Sinn Féin and Ulster. David Lowe rather more brutally communicated the same message in The Star on the 2nd of December 1921, with the last Ulsterman and the last Sinn Féiner refusing to find common ground before expiring. Exactly how Ulster's status was to be reconciled with Irish nationalist aspirations was clearly a conundrum for the cartoonists as well as for the negotiators. And so as it was seen at the time, successful climax to the conference on the 5th and 6th of December caught the artists somewhat unprepared. David Lowe provided a typically inventive and image-packed reaction on the 8th of December. In the bottom right of the frame, Lowe himself is busy burning all the excellent cartoons he would have published if they hadn't made peace. In the bottom left, disgusted diehards appear to be leaving the country to join the Spanish Foreign Legion. And John Borganova and myself have discussed exactly who these disgusted diehards are meant to be. Are they out of work black and tans? Are they disgruntled Irish Republicans? It's not really clear. A spectral figure, who Lowe says may either be Sir James Craig or the editor of Belfast's Northern Whig, is sitting on the headstone of the Irish Trouble, aged about 800 years, and is playing the Joy Jig Jazz on a concertina while Michael Collins and David Lloyd George rejoice in a frenzied embrace. So there are about 5 separate narratives going on in this cartoon, but I suppose the overall message is one of celebration and somewhat astonished delight at the finding of a solution apparently acceptable to all parties. Bernard Partridge had a few more days to reflect on the conference's outcome before his cartoon was published in Punch on the 14th of December. And again, he referenced the nationality of the Prime Minister, now appearing as Wales's patron St. David, supplementing the work of St. Patrick in ridding the newly named Irish Free State of the snake of mistrust. Lloyd George did, of course, take much of the credit for having conjured up the settlement from what had been thought at points to be an impossible position. As Boyce wrote, he found the key to the Irish puzzle where all before him had failed. British politicians came forward to welcome it and to claim a little bit of the glory for themselves, which prompted Lowe's cartoon of the 13th of December, showing not only Lloyd George, but Asquith, Birkenhead, Greenwood and Churchill, all hoping to stand on the pedestal dedicated to the imperishable memory of the man who saved Ireland. A Colonel Blimp diehard figure is moving off on the left there, presumably in disgust. And there's a very similar competition, albeit over a longer chronological span, going on in the Irish Spotlight in the Star on the 15th of December, where a diminutive Lloyd George is picked out from a cast of characters, Gladstone, Parnell, Campbell Bannerman, Redmond and Asquith, who might all have claimed some of the credit. So for the foreseeable future, British cartoonists might feel that the Irish question had indeed been solved. And in their relief and surprise, they were also able to celebrate with generosity the personalities of those of the Irish delegation who had made the solution possible. In this slide, I brought together 3 images that appeared in December 1921 and January 1922. Along the top, we have David Lowe's A Movie of Michael, which I think is a remarkable celebration of the glamour and charisma that was by this stage attaching itself to the figure of Michael Collins. He's being drawn as a movie star. Matt is less ebullient in his sketches, but no less friendly towards the Sinn Féin leaders. This is what he writes about Collins. Mr. Michael Collins, Minister of Finance in Dáil Éireann, the Irish Devoet, Mick to thousands of friends, was born at Clonakilty 30 years ago, worked in the GPO London in his early days and fought in the GPO Dublin during Easter week 1916. English government placed a big price on his head, but he lived to shake hands with English cabinet ministers, the most popular hero in Ireland, around whom the most extraordinary stories have been woven. Claims to have an intimate acquaintance with all the chimney pots of Dublin, is credited with hiding in a coffin in a hospital morgue while soldiers searched the beds for him. Used little disguise, but the authorities were handicapped by the official photograph, which is stated not to have been of Collins at all. Betrays a sense of humour by giving as his address House of Commons SW1. So for British political cartoonists, Michael Collins had attained celebrity status, and the reference to the Boer general from the South African War, Christian de Wet, is telling, given how fated de Wet and his fellow Boer leaders, including Smuts, were when they visited Britain not long after the Peace of Vereeniging had brought that unhappy conflict to an end in 1902. There was respect, recognition, and some enchantment in both cases. Most British cartoonists thought that the ratification of the peace in the Houses of Parliament brought an end to the matter, and that Sinn Féin and Nationalist Ireland would recognise, as perhaps its delegation in London had recognised, that what was being offered was not only a sensible deal, but also the furthest that any British government was able to go at the time. George Boyce writes that the settlement was one which had the full support of British public opinion, including those sections of opinion which had been most hostile to the government during the Black and Tan War. David Lowe, whatever his pen and ink love affair with Michael Collins, was not quite so sanguine. In this year's Pantomimes number 4, The Star, 22nd of December 1921, he draws Eamon de Valera as an unhappy Aladdin, rubbing the Doyle lamp, waiting to see what would happen next. The right-hand side of the frame is reserved for possible appearance of Republican genie, but that's another story. Thank you very much.
Right, Christopher. Thank you very much for that most interesting paper. And if I could ask you, Christopher, what were the editors of the papers saying at that time? You know, the way today we're very often the cartoons in the papers reflect either the views of the editors or vice versa. And I'm just wondering, at the time in these periodicals and magazines, was there an editorial connection with the cartoons?
It's a very good question, and I think the answer probably varies quite a lot from one publication to another. So in some of these magazines, so if you take the example of Punch, traditionally there would have been a discussion earlier in the week before the magazine was published as to the line to be taken in the major full-page big cut cartoons. So to a degree, the cartoonists were less in control of the editorial message. Their role was more to find an appropriate artistic expression. That had certainly been the case with Punch earlier in the 19th century. The extent to which that was still the case by this period is not really very clear. But I don't think there was a great misalignment between the cartoonists' views and the position that the magazine was taking up in British politics by this time anyway. It was quite traditional. and had moved a long way from its sort of radical roots. If you look at some of the other papers, then I think, again, you really have to look at every individual case. Will Dyson is a very interesting example. Will Dyson, the Australian cartoonist, came to work in Britain 1909 and really has an enormous impact on British political cartooning and on British journalism before the First World War. Very strong socialist cartoons in the Edwardian period, and also very opposed to conscription in Britain in 1915, his cartoons in 1915. So he was somebody who knew what he wanted to say politically, and he was going to say it, irrespective of whatever the editor of the newspaper might have thought. Staniforth, the Welsh political cartoonist, also had a very considerable degree of editorial independence. Now, David Lowe is perhaps the most celebrated example later in his career, when he's working for the Evening Standard, where the sort of myth goes that Beaverbrook said, you can pretty much draw anything you like. Beaverbrook, of course, was on the right of British politics. The Evening Standard was on the right of British politics. Lowe was more centre-left. That's another story, really, about the extent to which Lowe really had that level of independence. But I think cartoonists, by and large, they were expressing their own views. Those views were not normally going to be seriously out of alignment with the publications in which they appeared. But it's not automatically the case that they followed whatever the editorial line was, as was expressed in the written editorials. So sometimes you can see connections. They take their cue from a phrase or an image that's used, a turn of phrase that's used in the written editorial, and they develop a visual image from that. But at other times, there are definitely discrepancies. So that's one of the things I think that makes their work so interesting, is that you often have to kind of try and work out what is the relationship between what they're saying in their cartoons and what the newspaper is saying in its sort of more formal journalism.
But they clearly, the cartoons clearly reflect the public interest in the issue at the time. But of course, the British government was concerned with a whole lot of other international issues. I mean, the Irish, perhaps from an Irish perspective, the only subject matter on the agenda were the talks, or was independence and peace and trying to get a free state, or to get an independent state. Whereas Britain was tied, that was just one of many issues that Britain was dealing with. There were still the ongoing, unfinished business from the conference in Versailles, and so how quickly you mentioned early on there how that, you know, after the signing of the treaty terms in December, that basically cartoonists moved to other issues, which became the headlines. So where in fact did the Anglo-Irish Treaty, how long did it occupy basically the interest of the cartoonists before they moved on to other issues?
Not long at all, not I'd say. No, there are lots of other issues, and you know, it kind of surprised me when I went through the magazine, the Communist, how little there was in there on Ireland. To some extent, that's because there's a tremendous focus on industrial relations troubles in Britain in this period. There'd been, of course, a huge strike in Britain, the Triple Alliance strike, which had then sort of failed in April of 1921, and there were ongoing major industrial disputes. So it isn't long before the focus shifts. And to give you an example, you saw at the very end there David Lowe's cartoon about the pantomime with De Valera as Aladdin, and there were four other cartoons that he drew with a similar theme. One was on German reparations. Sorry, two were on German reparations. One was on the Geddes Acts, the sort of swinging cuts to public expenditure, and one was on taxation. So, you know, there were a whole range of other issues. I think cartoonists assumed the problem with Ireland had been solved, the treaty had been passed. I think with that exception of that cartoon by Lowe, it was anticipated it would also go through relatively smoothly in Ireland. And in a sense, you know, then the focus was moving on elsewhere. And I've done some work. I haven't done as much yet on this as I would like, but I've done some work on the Civil War in cartoons, and it's by no means as prominent an issue in British political cartooning. There are some cartoons, but they're relatively few and far between insofar as I've been able to discern thus far. And to some extent, that's because, of course, well, you know, Ireland was no longer a problem in the same way for British politicians, and so the focus just shifted onto something else.
And therefore, what were the consequences for the political leaders who involved themselves or were involved in the negotiations on behalf of the British, such as Lloyd George? I mean, I think he was gone within a year. Birkenhead also, and I think Birkenhead basically said he signed his political death warrant, and Michael Collins said, "I've served my own." But did the cartoonists focus on that? Did they attribute the consequences of the treaty, or was that a consequence of the treaty? What did it focus? Did cartooning essentially, when looking at those events, which occurred very shortly after the treaty, and in fact about the time that the Civil War was starting, did they focus on Ireland or the treaty as a reason for political oblivion for some of the people who've been involved?
I don't think they did. That isn't to say, I think you're right, of course. I think the outcome of the treaty was a major issue for those who were in the coalition who were dissatisfied with Lloyd George's premiership. And so it doesn't play to his advantage for very, very long at all. Cartoons, of course, are not they're not very good vehicles for explaining things with great subtlety, although I think you saw a couple of examples there where artists were being very inventive, you know, with the different images, the messages they could pack into a frame. What I am aware of is that some of the opposition within the Conservative Party to Lloyd George and within the Conservative press to Lloyd George that really began to build up in the course of 1922 certainly focused on developing a hostile cartoon commentary. So there's evidence that Lord Northcliffe told one of his cartoonists really to look at what was going on in the French press and to use some of those images to attack Lloyd George. This is in 1922. So I think that's very interesting as well. But cartoonists, they're very much of the moment, you know, and whatever had happened in that week or the day before, that was going to be the material for them to work on. Yeah, you struggle to find sort of lengthy analysis going on in political cartoons.
Rosemary Devereux, thank you very much for a very interesting contribution to our day's work. And she says, compared to other British political issues on the international stage, did the cartoonists give the Irish question more attention than others, or did the Germans get the same coverage? Additionally, did the War of Independence and its violent repercussions bring about a more serious response from the cartoonist to the Irish question than compared to historic representations? A very good question.
No, that is an excellent question. And yeah. I think what you see in political cartoons during the War of Independence is you certainly see, it was referred to at the very beginning in Queever's paper, you certainly see this articulation of the sort of murder gang narrative on the one hand, but you also see in the left of centre press revulsion at what's going on in the name of the British government in Ireland, and so it's a space in which these very brutal images can be brought forward. They're either on the front page or they're right in the middle of the news commentary in many British newspapers by 1920, 1921. And they're sending out messages that really this kind of thing isn't where the British state should be, and where British public opinion is increasingly having problems coming to terms with the nature of the conflict in Ireland.
Niall Murray asks, did any named or identifiable women appear in the cartoons of the time?
On Ireland?
Around these issues or at the time, but I suppose certainly in Ireland there were women representatives in Dáil Éireann who were very, very strident, very articulate, very intelligent women who had very strong public views and expressed them. And I'm just wondering, did this find its way at all into the cartoons?
I haven't come across any evidence of that. What you see with political cartoonists is they're operating with probably a relatively small cast of characters. So traditionally, cartoonists would have used representations of the nation, like Erin or John Bull or Britannia, things like that, or animals like the German eagle or the French cockerel. As the political debates become a little bit more sophisticated, as photography begins to enter into newspapers, obviously movie reels and so on, so individual politicians increasingly are being recognized. And so you do see politicians being drawn as themselves, not just the prime ministers, but a wider cast of characters than that. Having said that, the risk for the cartoonist is if you're having to label somebody to explain who they are, you probably are not communicating your message as effectively or as powerfully as you might like. So there are relatively few cartoons being drawn at this time that I can think of British female politicians, let alone of Irish female politicians. So you're probably operating with leaders of the opposition, you know, government, cabinet, high up cabinet members, and then various trade union leaders, leaders of the Labour Party, that kind of thing. It's not a very, very large cast of named characters, maybe 20, 25 or so that cartoonists are normally working with.
Well, thank you very much for that response, Chris. That brings us to the end of time. In fact, we're just slightly over, but so I'm going to have to finish it there. But thank you very much for a most interesting contribution towards the conference.
Thanks very much.
So we'll leave it there. Thank you, Chris.